The video arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Bryce Harlan was sitting alone in his living room, the television casting a dim blue glow across the walls of their Beacon Hill brownstone. His phone vibrated on the coffee table. Unknown number. No message. Just a video file. He almost didn't open it. Something about the anonymity felt wrong, dangerous. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you're alone, and your wife texted 2 hours ago saying she'd be late coming home from her book club meeting. He tapped the screen. The footage was grainy, shot from above. Security camera. The timestamp read November 12, 2023 at 9:23 p.m. Rain streaked across the lens. The location was clearly an alleyway, narrow and poorly lit, somewhere in the city. Two figures stood between parked cars, partially obscured by shadows. A man and a woman. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket. The woman had her back to the camera, but Bryce recognized the coat immediately. The cream-colored trench coat he'd bought Eliza for her birthday last year. The one with the distinctive belt that she always tied in a specific way. His breath caught in his chest. The man leaned closer to her. Too close. The kind of closeness that exists only between people who share secrets. Who share everything. The woman's hand reached up to touch his face. It was tender. Intimate. The gesture of someone who had done this before, many times before. The man's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him. Bryce knew that jacket. He knew that posture. He knew the way his wife tilted her head when she wanted to be kissed. And he knew the man. Even in the grainy footage, even with the rain distorting the image, he knew exactly who it was. Declan Ives. His best friend since college. The guy who had been the best man at their wedding. The guy who came over every Sunday for dinner. The guy Bryce trusted with everything. He watched the video again. And again. And again. 27 times in total. Each viewing revealed another detail that carved deeper into his chest. The way Declan's hand cradled the back of Eliza's head. The way she pressed herself against him without hesitation. The way they stood there for 43 seconds before finally pulling apart and walking in different directions, as if they'd choreographed their separation to avoid suspicion. The rain continued to fall in the video. The timestamp never changed. 9:23 p.m., less than 3 hours ago. While Bryce had been sitting at home, trusting, believing, waiting, his wife had been in an alley with his best friend, destroying everything. He didn't cry. He didn't throw the phone. He just sat there in the darkness, watching the video loop, feeling something cold and heavy settle into his bones. Something that felt like grief but tasted like rage. The sound of keys in the front door came at 12:14 a.m. Before we understand what happened next, you need to know how we got here. You need to understand the story of three people who were once inseparable. Three people who built their lives around a friendship so strong that nothing should have been able to break it. Bryce Harlan and Declan Ives met during freshman orientation at Boston University in the fall of 2011. They were assigned as roommates in Warren Towers, and what started as a random housing placement became a brotherhood. They were different in almost every way. Bryce was methodical, studying economics and planning every detail of his future. Declan was spontaneous, an art student who believed life was meant to be experienced rather than calculated. But somehow, those differences complemented each other perfectly. They spent 4 years navigating college together. Late-night study sessions that turned into philosophical debates. Road trips to Maine on weekends when they should have been writing papers. They held each other up through failures and celebrated each other's victories as if they were their own. Then, in their senior year, Bryce met Eliza Vaughn. She was a junior majoring in English literature, working part-time at the campus bookstore where Bryce stopped every Thursday to buy coffee. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a smile that made him forget whatever he'd been thinking about. Their first conversation was about a book she was reading, something by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Bryce had pretended to know more about magical realism than he actually did, just to keep her talking. Declan had been the one who encouraged him to ask her out. Declan had been the one who helped him plan the perfect first date. And Declan had been there when Bryce fell in love so completely that it changed the shape of his entire world. The three of them became a unit, Bryce and Eliza. Eliza and Declan. Declan and Bryce. They graduated within a year of each other and all stayed in Boston. Bryce landed a position at a financial consulting firm. Eliza began teaching at a private high school in Cambridge. Declan opened a small art gallery in the South End, showcasing local artists and somehow making just enough to survive. They had dinners every Sunday at Bryce and Eliza's place in Beacon Hill. They took trips together to Vermont in the fall to see the leaves change, and to Cape Cod in the summer to rent a beach house for a week. They spent New Year's Eve together every year, the three of them on Bryce's rooftop, watching fireworks over the harbor and making toasts to friendship that would last forever. Bryce trusted Declan with everything. He'd given him the spare key to their house. He'd made him the executor of his will. When Bryce proposed to Eliza in 2019, Declan had been the first person he'd told, even before his own parents. And when they got married in a small ceremony overlooking the Boston Public Garden, Declan had stood beside Bryce as his best man and given a speech that made everyone cry. Looking back, Bryce would spend countless hours trying to identify the moment it started. When did Eliza and Declan become more than friends? Was it something he'd missed? Some look they'd exchanged across the dinner table? Some text message that arrived at a strange hour? Or had it always been there, lurking beneath the surface of their perfect trio, waiting for the right moment to emerge and destroy everything? But on that Tuesday night, November 12, 2023, sitting in the dark with his phone in his hand, Bryce wasn't thinking about when it started. He was only thinking about how it needed to end. The sound of keys in the door. Eliza's voice calling out, bright and casual, as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Bryce? Sorry I'm so late. The book club ran over and then there was an accident on Storrow Drive, and traffic was a nightmare." He stood up from the couch. His legs felt strange, disconnected from his body. He walked to the foyer where Eliza was hanging up that cream-colored coat, the one that was still damp from the rain. What happened in the next 37 minutes would become the subject of countless police interviews, forensic reports, and eventually a confession that would shock everyone who thought they knew Bryce Harlan. But that's not where this story becomes public. The public story begins the next morning, November 13th, at 6:42 a.m., when Bryce Harlan called 911 to report that his wife was missing. The 911 operator's voice was calm and professional. She asked standard questions. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Did she take her car? Bryce's answers were perfect. Each word measured and delivered with exactly the right amount of concern. He last saw her when she left for book club around 7 p.m. She was wearing jeans and a cream coat. Her car was still in the garage, which was strange because she always drove to her friend Sarah's house in Cambridge for book club. He'd waited up for her until after midnight, he said. When she didn't come home, he'd tried calling. Straight to voicemail. He'd texted. No response. He'd finally fallen asleep on the couch around 2 a.m., assuming she'd stayed at Sarah's. But when he woke up at 6 and she still wasn't home, he'd started to panic. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Two officers, Martinez and O'Connor, both veterans who'd seen their share of missing person cases in Boston. Most of them resolved themselves within 48 hours. Husband and wife had a fight. Wife stayed at a friend's house. Everyone reconciled by the weekend. But they followed protocol anyway. They walked through the house with Bryce, noting everything. The bed upstairs was perfectly made. Eliza's phone charger was still plugged in on her nightstand. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter. Inside it, they found her wallet, her driver's license, $73 in cash, and 3 credit cards. Her phone was missing, but everything else was there. Officer Martinez asked the obvious question. Had there been any arguments? Any tension in the marriage? Any reason Eliza might want to leave? Bryce's performance was masterful. He hesitated at exactly the right moment. He looked down at his hands. He took a breath that seemed to cost him something, and then he said the words that would redirect the entire investigation. "There's something you need to see." He pulled out his phone and showed them the video, the grainy footage of the alley, the rain, the two figures, Eliza and Declan, the intimate embrace, the way they held each other like lovers who'd been apart too long. "I received this last night," Bryce said, his voice cracking in all the right places. "Around midnight. From an unknown number. I don't know who sent it, but that's Eliza. And that's Declan Ives." He's been my best friend for over a decade. I trusted him with everything." Officer O'Connor asked if Bryce had confronted Eliza about the video. "She never came home," Bryce said. "That's why I'm so worried. I got this video at midnight, and she still hasn't come back. What if something happened? What if Declan did something to her?" The implication hung in the air, heavy and dark. A jealous lover. A confrontation that went wrong. A woman who never made it home. The officers exchanged glances. This changed things. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was potential foul play. By noon on November 13th, Detective Sarah Lee from the Boston Police Department's Homicide Unit had been assigned to the case. She was 39 years old, 17 years on the force, and had a reputation for seeing through the obvious to find the truth that people tried to hide. She watched the video that Bryce had received. She noted the timestamp. She made a list of questions that needed answers. The first person she wanted to talk to was Declan Ives. They brought him in at 2:15 p.m. He arrived at the station confused and worried. He'd known Eliza was missing. Bryce had called him that morning, voice shaking, asking if he'd seen her. Declan had said no. He hadn't seen her since Sunday dinner. That had been a lie, and Detective Lee was about to prove it. She sat across from him in interview room 3, a small gray space with a table bolted to the floor and a camera mounted in the corner. She slid her tablet across the table and pressed play on the video. Declan's face went pale, then red, then pale again. He watched himself on the screen, standing in that alley with Eliza, holding her the way you hold someone you love. When the video ended, there was silence. "Want to change your story?" Lee asked. Declan put his head in his hands. "God, this is such a mess. Start from the beginning." And he did. The affair had started 6 months earlier, in May. It hadn't been planned. They'd run into each other at a coffee shop in the South End. Bryce had been traveling for work. They'd started talking, and somehow the conversation had turned personal. Eliza had admitted she felt lonely in her marriage. Bryce worked constantly, traveled every other week, and when he was home, he was distracted. Declan had admitted he'd always felt something for her, even back in college, but he'd never acted on it because of Bryce. One confession led to another. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into drinks. And then one night in late May, they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. "But I didn't hurt her," Declan insisted, leaning forward, his voice desperate. "I would never hurt her. I love her." "Where were you last night?" Lee asked. "I was with her. In that alley." "That's from last night, right?" The timestamp says 9:23. "We met there because it's between my gallery and where she'd told Bryce she was going. She had book club, but she texted me and said she could spare 30 minutes. We talked. We kissed. And then she left to go home. That was around 9:30. I went back to my gallery. I was there alone until about 11, doing inventory. Then I went home. Can anyone verify that?" "No, I was alone." "So you're telling me you were the last person to see Eliza Vaughn alive, you were having an affair with her, and you have no alibi for the rest of the night?" Declan's eyes widened. "Alive? What do you mean alive? You don't think she's dead, do you?" Detective Lee didn't answer. She asked more questions. About the affair. About whether Eliza had seemed upset or scared. About whether there were other men. About whether Eliza had wanted to leave Bryce. Declan answered everything. He had nothing to hide anymore. The affair was exposed. His friendship with Bryce was destroyed. The only thing he cared about now was finding Eliza. He told Lee that Eliza had been planning to tell Bryce everything. She'd said she wanted a divorce. She loved Declan, and she couldn't keep lying anymore. They'd talked about it in the alley the night before. Eliza had been nervous but determined. She was going to go home and tell Bryce the truth. "And you believed that was a good idea?" Lee asked. "I told her to wait. I told her we should plan it better. But she said she couldn't stand lying to him anymore. She said he deserved to know." Detective Lee made notes. She asked Declan if Bryce had known about the affair before last night. "No," Declan said. "At least, I don't think so. Eliza was careful. We both were. We never met at obvious places. We never texted anything incriminating. Everything was in person or through signal messages that we deleted. How would he have known? Lee turned the tablet back toward him and replayed the video. Someone sent this to Bryce at 11:47 p.m. last night. Any idea who? Declan stared at the screen. No, I have no idea. We didn't even know there was a camera in that alley. We'd met there a few times before. It felt private. Nothing's private anymore, Lee said. They released Declan at 4:47 p.m. but told him not to leave the city. He was officially a person of interest. The affair gave him motive. The timeline made him the last known person to see Eliza, and his lack of alibi put him at the center of their investigation. But Detective Lee had more questions than answers. If Declan had hurt Eliza, where was the body? Why would he admit to the affair so readily if he was guilty? And who had sent that video to Bryce? She decided to dig deeper into Bryce Harlan's story. The first crack appeared in his timeline at 7:32 p.m. on November 13th. A detective named Marcus Webb had been assigned to review surveillance footage from cameras near Bryce and Eliza's home. The brownstone was on a residential street in Beacon Hill, but there were cameras at both ends of the block, mounted on historic street lamps as part of the neighborhood security system. Webb found something interesting. At 12:09 a.m. on November 13th, just 22 minutes after Bryce claimed Eliza came home, a figure emerged from the Harlans, front door carrying 2 large black garbage bags. The figure was male, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap. He walked to the end of the block, away from the street lamp, and placed the bags in a dumpster behind a construction site 3 doors down. The figure was Bryce Harlan. Webb confirmed it by comparing his gait and build to other footage of Bryce from earlier in the week. Detective Lee obtained a warrant. At 9:15 p.m., she and 4 other officers converged on the construction site. They found the dumpster. They found the bags. Inside the first bag was Eliza's clothing: jeans, a sweater, underwear, shoes. All of it soaked with blood. Inside the second bag was a bedsheet, also blood-soaked, and a lamp from the Harlans' living room. The base was cracked and covered in hair and blood. They arrested Bryce Harlan at 10:03 p.m. on November 13th, less than 48 hours after Eliza's death. The interrogation began at 11:20 p.m. Detective Lee sat across from Bryce, who had declined his right to an attorney. He still thought he could talk his way out of this. He still believed his performance would hold. Lee laid out the evidence: the surveillance footage of him disposing of the bags, the bloody clothing, the murder weapon, the inconsistencies in his timeline. She also revealed something Bryce didn't know. His GPS data from his phone placed him at home the entire night. He'd never left, which meant Eliza had definitely come home, just as he'd claimed. But she'd never left. "Where is she, Bryce?" Lee asked. He said nothing. "We know you killed her. We have the evidence. We have the weapon. We have the surveillance. The only question is, where did you put her body?" Bryce stared at the table. His perfect facade was cracking. His hands trembled. His jaw clenched. And then, finally, he spoke. "She came home at 12:14. I was waiting in the foyer. I showed her the video. I asked her to explain. She didn't even try to deny it. She said she was sorry. She said she was in love with Declan. She said she wanted a divorce." His voice was flat now, mechanical, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "I asked her how long. She said 6 months. 6 months she'd been lying to my face. 6 months she'd been sneaking around with my best friend. 6 months I'd been the idiot who didn't know his wife and his best friend were destroying everything we'd built." "What happened next?" Lee asked. "I don't remember picking up the lamp. I don't remember the first hit. I just remember her on the floor, and there was so much blood and I couldn't stop. I hit her again and again until she stopped moving. Until she stopped making those sounds." The confession continued for 47 minutes. Bryce described how he'd wrapped Eliza's body in the bedsheet, how he'd driven to a state park 30 miles west of Boston at 3 in the morning, how he'd buried her in a shallow grave near a hiking trail he and Eliza used to walk every autumn. He'd come home, cleaned the living room, disposed of the evidence, and then waited until morning to call 911. The plan had been simple. Let the police find the video. Let them suspect Declan. An affair gone wrong. A jealous lover who killed his mistress. It would have worked if he'd been more careful about the surveillance cameras. If he'd thought about the GPS on his phone. If he'd been smarter. But rage makes people stupid. And Bryce Harlan's rage had consumed him so completely that he'd made mistakes he couldn't undo. They found Eliza's body at 6:42 a.m. on November 14th, in the exact location Bryce described. She was 29 years old. She'd been a teacher, a wife, a woman who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to die for them. Bryce Harlan was charged with first-degree murder. At his trial 7 months later, in June 2024, his defense attorney argued crime of passion, temporary insanity, extreme emotional disturbance. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and found him guilty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Declan Ives gave a statement at the sentencing hearing. He said he would carry the guilt of the affair for the rest of his life. He said he'd destroyed his best friend's life and contributed to the death of a woman he loved. He closed his gallery and moved away from Boston. No one knows where he is now. The video that started everything, that grainy footage from a rainy alley, became evidence exhibit A. It had been sent from a burner phone purchased at a convenience store in Somerville. The phone was never recovered. Investigators believe it was someone who knew about the affair, perhaps someone who'd seen Eliza and Declan together before, and decided to expose them. The sender's identity remains unknown. The case became a reminder that love and trust, once broken, can create monsters out of ordinary people. Bryce Harlan had been a respected professional, a devoted husband, a loyal friend, but in the span of 37 minutes, he'd become a killer. All because of a text message, all because of a video, all because he couldn't accept that the life he'd built had been a carefully constructed lie. In the end, 3 lives were destroyed that rainy November night. Eliza Vaughn, who paid with her life for the mistake of falling in love with the wrong person. Declan Ives, who lost everything because he couldn't resist the pull of a forbidden connection. And Bryce Harlan, who let his rage overpower his reason and threw away his entire future in a moment of violence he could never take back. The text that ruined a marriage ended up costing so much more than anyone could have imagined. It revealed a truth that needed to stay hidden. It exposed wounds that could never heal. And it proved that sometimes the greatest danger in our lives comes not from strangers in dark alleys, but from the people we trust most. Sitting in dark rooms, watching videos on repeat. Letting hatred grow where love used to live. See you in the next one.